People to settle down because I want to start the meeting. Right, thank you for coming. My name's Maxine Bowler. I'm your chair for the meeting. This meeting is on Tony Cliff, the making of a revolutionary. Ian Birchall, who I've been told was in the IS in 1963, so obviously knows quite a lot about Tony Cliff. He's going to speak for about 35 minutes, and afterwards I think we're going to take questions by a show of hand. So without any further ado, we'll get on with it.
Right, comrades, I'm told this microphone works if you're not too close to it. Everybody here all right? Yes, right, fine. OK, comrades, I think to begin with, what one has to say is that if it weren't for Tony Cliff, we wouldn't be here now. That it was because of both the enormous theoretical contribution he made and his absolutely remorseless commitment to the building of the organisation that actually accounts for the fact that the SWP exists as it does. And for the last couple of years I've been working, not nearly as hard as I ought to have been working, but I am working on writing a biography of Cliff, because he certainly was the most remarkable person I ever met in my lifetime. And I would like to try and convey at least a part of that. There's no way you can convey all that it meant to have Cliff haranguing you about something. That is a experience. Some people here have had it, and if you haven't had it, then you don't know what it's like. But to try and convey some part of what this very remarkable individual was like, and what I want to talk about today is the first part of Cliff's life, because there's quite a few people in this room who knew Cliff from around 1960 onwards. But really the question is, how did Cliff become a revolutionary? What were his origins? Because actually it's quite implausible that he should have become a revolutionary. I should also say that I don't want to engage in hagiography. Cliff was not a saint, and I think a number of people in this room can vouch for that. But that's quite fortunate, actually, because on my study of history, I've never heard of a saint building a revolutionary party. So Cliff was born under the name Igael Gluckstein in Palestine in May 1917, at a time when that was still part of the Ottoman Empire. His parents had moved to Palestine from Russia, and they were among the very first of the generation who settled, who began Jewish settlement in Palestine. At the time of Cliff's birth, there were only 60,000 Jews in Palestine, as against, I think, 750,000 Arabs. And his family, therefore, were right at the centre of the Zionist project. His father was a building contractor who was the partner of Chigil Weizmann, the brother of Chaim Weizmann, who later became the first president of Israel. Cliff was born, interestingly, in a small village called Zichron Yaakov. Zichron Yaakov was established by the Rothschild family as a wine-growing colony, as one of the first settlements, first Jewish settlements, which Rothschild, as a keen Zionist, was encouraging in Palestine. And Rothschild's agent in Palestine, a man called Kalvarisky, was married to Cliff's father's sister. So Cliff himself was what was known as a sabra, a prickly pear, one of the new generation of Jews born in Palestine. So here's somebody born in a village established by the Baron de Rothschild at the very heart of Zionism. It's not a very likely place to become one of the most important revolutionary socialists in Britain in the 20th century. Indeed, if you look at Palestinian Trotskyism, and it was never a very large current, virtually all the other people involved in Trotskyism in Palestine were people who had emigrated to Palestine, often in order to avoid the rise of Hitler, and who actually had roots in a socialist movement outside Palestine. So really this is the first question I think we have to try and look at. How did Cliff actually break through this situation? How did he become a revolutionary? There's a number of things one can find in his childhood, and actually I know very little about his childhood. He was educated in a Montessori kindergarten. He went to Vienna at the age of 5. And then when he was about 10, his father's firm went bankrupt. And I think this probably had an important effect on him, showing him that the capitalist system that his parents were an integral part of actually wasn't as solid and permanent as he'd believed it was. But I think crucially, Cliff becomes aware of the contradictions within Zionism, because Zionism historically is a very contradictory phenomenon. Zionism was the product of oppression. It was the product of anti-Semitism, particularly from the time of the Dreyfus case onwards, and does also have to be said, the amazingly inadequate role that the socialist movement played at the time of the Dreyfus case. Zionism grew up as a reaction to Jewish oppression, but as the Jewish population settled in Palestine, they themselves very rapidly started turning into oppressors. And so you have this duality that on the one hand, Cliff is brought up among the rhetoric of emancipation and indeed the rhetoric of socialism. Sorry. A great many Zionists considered themselves to be socialists. Yet at the same time, those socialist principles they talked about didn't extend to the Arab population. And Cliff himself recounts that from quite an early age, he starts asking the question, so why do the Arab kids not have shoes on their feet? So why do the Arab kids not get to come to the same school as I go to? And it was that really, I think, that was crucial in leading Cliff into politics. And in fact, he moved into politics very early, at the age of 14, joining a left Zionist party called Mapai, and then fairly rapidly thereafter becoming involved in what were known as the Marxist circles, which were an organisation on the left wing of Mapai. Mapai was still a Zionist party, and for 3 or 4 years, Cliff is clearly in a very ambiguous relationship towards Zionism. It's not, that he woke up one morning and said, "I'm not a Zionist anymore." He had to work through the thing. But he does appear to have been an extremely single-minded person. Once he got involved in politics, that was effectively his life. There's a wonderful little questionnaire he did for the New Statesman in 1994, and among other things, he's asked, "What is your favourite piece of music?" To which Cliff's answer was, "I do not listen to music." And I think that sort of typifies, the absolute focus, the relentless focus that Cliff had. In that way, I think, and I don't want to push the comparisons too far, very much more akin to Lenin than to, say, Marx or Trotsky. But he does appear to have made an enormous impression on people. I had a very interesting and rather moving experience last year. I located in Paris a lady who's now in her mid-80s and quite a well-known abstract painter called Hannah Ben-Dov, who had known Cliff from the time of the Marxist circles in the mid-1930s. And I wrote to her and said, "Can I come and interview you?" And I said, I'm trying to write this biography because Cliff was a very remarkable person. And I got a note back from her. Remember, this woman had not seen Cliff since 1946. She hadn't, in fact, until she got my letter. She hadn't heard that he had died. But she writes back to me, yes, he was. He was a remarkable man, a genius, and more. And that's the kind of impression that Cliff seems to have left on people over a very long time. At the same time, he also showed a gift, which I think many people here again can testify to, the ability to get people to do jobs. One of the first things, when he got to know Hannah, one of the very first things he persuaded her to do was to translate State and Revolution into Hebrew. But at the same time, his activism always runs alongside theory. For Cliff, he was always an enormous reader. He took this, I believe, from his mother, who was also apparently always surrounded by piles of books. But the reading and the writing always went alongside with involvement in activity. But his first serious political article was written at the age of 18. He mentions this article in his autobiography, but nobody had ever seen it, as far as I know, until I found it in the Jewish National Library last year and got it translated. And it really is quite a remarkable article. It's about the agrarian question in Egypt. Once again, perhaps not the subject all of us would choose for our first political article. But the point is, of course, that Cliff, although he already by this time clearly saw himself as a Trotskyist, didn't have a great deal to go on, because Trotskyism had very few roots in the Middle East, and therefore any specific account of the Middle East was lacking. There's a letter from Trotsky around this time where he's asked his position on Palestine and Zionism, and he starts off by saying, well, I haven't really studied the question. So what Cliff is trying to do is get an understanding, and what he does, for example, is try to apply the theory of permanent revolution to the situation in Egypt. The Egyptian bourgeoisie cannot assume any role of emancipation from feudal shackles because of the internal contradictions undermining the Egyptian capitalist regime itself. Abolition of Egypt's feudal class division would mean, given the decay of the Egyptian capitalist economy and the exacerbation of social conflicts within it, abolition of the class division of society as a whole. And therefore he concludes the central role in the liberation of the masses of peasantry in Egypt can only be performed by the proletariat, which, while struggling within the capitalist regime for its own liberation, liberates all the masses of oppressed toilers. Now, it's interesting, there's no mention of Zionism in the article. I think that's partly because Cliff was still... Well, he was writing for a Zionist magazine, so it probably would never have got published if he'd made a head-on attack on Zionism. But it's also, I think, because for Cliff, Zionism was not the starting point, and this becomes, I think, even more clear in the articles he wrote in 1938, by which time he'd broken with the Marxist circles and had aligned himself formally with the Fourth International. There appears to have been a very, very small grouping at this time. In the documentation of the founding Congress of the Fourth International, there is reference to people in Palestine who can't travel to this conference. But when you have the list of numbers of members, there's no mention of Palestine. So clearly the numbers were on the small side, since some groups of 10 are, in fact, listed. But anyhow, he wrote an article for the American, a set of 3 articles, in fact, for the American journal New International. Now, many critics since have looked at these articles and said there is a significant shift in Cliff's position, that he is much less hostile to Zionism in these articles than he was to be 20 or 30 years later. And that's true. But of course, one of the reasons for that is not Cliff's inconsistency, but the fact that Zionism got a lot nastier. That Zionism, as Cliff well knew, was quite a nasty thing in the 30s. But it was not yet the ideology of a state. The important thing, I think, what is interesting, is Cliff begins with imperialism. What is the role of imperialism? Remember, Palestine is under British rule. The British had taken it when the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The British had taken it. And of course, at this time, it was not clear that Britain would opt for the Zionist solution. You know, in retrospect, we may say that's the way Zionism was inevitably heading. At the time, the British were quite happily playing off the Jews and Arabs against each other, using the tactic of divide and rule that they've been so fond of throughout imperial history. And so Cliff starts with imperialism and then moves on to the way in which imperialism uses Zionism. I think this is very important because this actually undermines the thing that is often thrown at Cliff and people like him, who are accused of being self-hating Jews. Now, I think anyone who met Cliff for more than 5 minutes would know that the term self-hating was a singularly inappropriate term to apply to him. But I think it's also clear that is always, you know, it is not rancor against Zionism that is the starting point for Cliff. On the contrary, what he argues for very powerfully in these articles is united action by Jewish and Arab workers. Palestine cannot emancipate itself from the imperialist yoke unless a unification of the Arab and Jewish masses takes place. For the latter represent a third of the population, the Jewish workers are half of the Palestine working class, and Jewish economy is decisive in many branches of industry. He also argues at this time, in 1938, in favour of Jewish immigration to Palestine. That was a position he was to reverse very sharply a few years later. But at this point he's still arguing that actually socialists should support Jewish immigration to Palestine and that they should attempt to persuade the Arab working class to support it too. This already involved Cliff in the international movement. There was a very sharp polemic against Cliff's position, arguing that he was being soft on Zionism, to put it very simply, from a South African journal published by the Spark Group. And Cliff replied to this very, very vigorously. Then comes the Second World War, and at the outbreak of war, he was immediately interned. Last year in Frankfurt, I met a man now over 90 called Jakob Moneta, who's actually a very well-known German Trotskyist, who had first met Cliff in jail in 1939. And Moneta has described some of the conditions. You know, it really makes Guantanamo look like a holiday camp. There were sort of 30-odd of them all sleeping on the floor in one room, many of them covered in lice. And the caring British authorities, of course, did provide medical inspection. Moneta describes the medical inspection. We stood in a long row and were led forward to a British military doctor who asked, "Everything all right?" We replied, "Yes, sir." The medical inspection was concluded. And Moneta also told me that despite these appalling conditions, Cliff was not in any way subdued. On the contrary, he attempted to make speeches at night when everyone else was trying to get to sleep, and the other prisoners had to shut him up. After he got out of jail, he continued to live in semi-clandestine conditions. His sister-in-law told me about how she and his brother had helped him when he was hiding in an orange grove, and they used to take him food, but being Cliff, he wanted food, but even more he wanted books. And his sister-in-law, who was a student at the Jerusalem University, which was a very small university at the time, was studying something quite different, but she had to constantly go into the library and ask for more and more books on the agrarian question, making herself very conspicuous. Why is this woman so enthusiastic about the agrarian question? The fruit of all this was his first book, which was completed around 44, 45, which has never been published, and there is a copy of it in the archives at Warwick University. And if there is anybody here with a scanner and a bit of time on their hands, it would be very nice if we could put it on the Marxist Internet Archive at some point. But being Cliff, of course, he was not only interested in writing. He was also very much concerned to build an organisation, and the organisation, the Revolutionary Communist League, gradually built up a nucleus of people. It was never very large, never more than 20 or 30 people. It did include some quite remarkable people, on the other hand. It included a man called Jabra Nicola, who had been for a number of years a leading figure in the Palestinian Communist Party, but who broke with the Communist Party over there, basically because the Communist Party split into two national sections with different lines. Also a man called Gabriel Baer, who subsequently became a very distinguished scholar of the Middle East. They produced a paper called Kol Hama Ahmed, which means Voice of the Class. The Communist Party had a paper called Voice of the People, so the Trotskyist paper took the title Voice of the Class. Unfortunately, I haven't managed as yet. I still have hopes to locate copies of this paper. It is in the catalogue of the Jewish National Library in Jerusalem, but when I visited there, I was told it had been mislaid. Whether incompetence or political censorship, I'm not in a position to say. In 1944, the Palestinian Trotskyists published an open letter to the British Labour Party, which appeared in Workers' International News in Britain. Don't know whether Cliff actually drafted it, but he must have been involved in its production in some way, in which he insists Britain's workers will support the colonies in their struggle for freedom, forging a new international solidarity for the building of a new society. But one of the most fateful things that happened around this time was in 1944, when Cliff... 10 minutes. Yes. Chris Bambury will give me more time, won't you, Chris? Cliff was taken by a young man called Danny Tate, who still lives in Barnet, to a kibbutz. which had asked for Cliff to go as a speaker. One of the people on this kibbutz was a young woman from South Africa whose family had recently moved to Palestine and who was very keen to get in touch with the Trotskyists in Palestine. She's sitting in the front row. I won't say any more because I'm not here to butter up honey, but I think it is absolutely clear. I think anyone who knows anything about it would know that if it had not been for honey, the Cliff we knew would not have existed without Honey's constant support. And so his marriage to Honey in 1945 or 46? Whenever. 45, right. Was clearly a very important point. But Cliff, I think, by this time was becoming disillusioned with Palestine. You see, his interest in Egypt persisted. Cliff insisted that Egypt was the, if you like, the key to the Middle East because it had the most developed working class. That in effect the Palestine situation could not be solved within the frontiers of Palestine. It had to be solved by a working class revolution in the Middle East. He thought of moving to Egypt, but given that he was now married to somebody with a British passport, he decided to move to Europe, tried to settle in France and failed, came to Britain, but was stateless, and indeed was stateless until the day he died. Just one further point on Palestine. I think one of the things that comes out of Cliff's experience is the fact that the organisation he had in Palestine was so small. That if it had been an organisation of a few thousand with the line of the RCL, then the whole situation at the end of the Second World War could have been different. People have often accused Cliff of being obsessed with numbers. And, he notes in his biography of Trotsky, in no country did the Trotskyists achieve the minimum critical mass required to be effective in building a real mass organisation. There was a chasm between what the historical situation demanded and what was possible. Anyhow, he ended up in Britain. If you look at the Fourth International Press at this time, what is absolutely remarkable is the sheer energy, the articles of Cliff, some on the Middle East, a whole number on Russia, a major polemic with Ernest Mandel about the economic perspectives, an important study on India and on the need for unity between Hindu and Muslim workers. All of this pouring out, despite the fact that he's living in this very insecure position. He's only able to stay in Britain because he is in some way under the protection of an ILP Member of Parliament, Campbell Stephen, who then proceeded to die, and Cliff had to go and spend the next 4 years in Ireland. And at the same time, he's involved in the crisis of Trotskyism because Trotskyism was now in a profound crisis in Britain. After playing a very, very honourable role during the Second World War, there was a problem. That Trotsky had predicted that neither Stalinism nor Reformism could survive the Second World War. In fact, both Stalinism and Reformism emerged strengthened from the Second World War. So, of course, you have the basic problem. Do you keep the analysis and make the facts fit the analysis, or do you develop the analysis so that it fits the facts? Most people found the first option easier, and it was, as Cliff used to say, like trying to find your way around the Paris metro with a map of the London Underground. The perspectives of the Fourth International simply didn't fit the reality. And it's out of this argument Cliff becomes involved in the debate about the nature of Russia. The orthodox definition, of course, was Russia was a degenerated workers' state. And Cliff was originally brought in as this bright young man from Palestine to defend the orthodoxy. After a few months of studying the question, he went over to the other side and argued that Russia was state capitalist. Now, there's a lot to be said about that. argument, and there simply isn't time to deal with that now. That really is a different meeting. But he was, as I said, for 4 years in Ireland. And in particular, he enjoyed the encouragement and protection of a leading intellectual in Dublin called Sheehy Skeffington, who used to generally take refugees, political exiles, under his wing. There's a letter from Sheehy Skeffington, quoted in his biography, in which he writes, "We had an excellent Fabian meeting at which a Jewish refugee from Israel, yes, he had done jail there for taking a proper socialist line about Arabs, attacked the Soviet persecution of the Jews, the doctor's plot, etc., and he was so well informed that the Stalinists present nearly lynched him. He was of Russian stock, Israel-born, and read Russian fluently, and knew his facts. A good meeting." Now, I think it's fairly clear who that was. Cliff made a certain impact with his writings on state capitalism. I mean, there is a letter from about 1951, I think, from the Cuban Trotskyists urging the French revolutionaries around the group Socialisme ou Barbarie to study the work of Cliff. So clearly he was making an impact here. But he was, at the time of the Korean War, expelled from the British section of the Fourth International, now very much under the control of a man called Jerry Healy, whom you may have heard of. He's a particularly thuggish individual. It's often alleged that this was because Cliff, in some way, capitulated over the Korean War. He did, in fact, write a remarkable article, which, again, I don't think is available anywhere, called The Struggle of the Powers, in which he writes, "In their mad rush for profit, the two gigantic imperialist powers are threatening the existence of world civilization, threatening humanity with the terrible suffering of atomic war. The interests of the working class, of humanity, demand that neither of the imperialist world powers be supported, but that both be struggled against. The battle cry of the real, genuine socialists today must be neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism." Now, in the 1950s, Cliff published a number of books, published 2 books with commercial publishers on Eastern Europe and on China with Allen and Unwin. Apparently, he first was able to do this because Allen and Unwin had made a huge profit out of their book on the Kon-Tiki expedition, and therefore were able to take risks with 1 or 2 unknown writers. I don't know whether Thor Heyerdahl had that in mind. But what was important is that although he spent a great deal of time developing the theory of state capitalism, he also had this constant concern with holding the organisation together. He would apparently ring people up the day before their Labour Party ward meeting, tell them what they were supposed to say, and then ring them up again the day after and find out what they'd said, and so on. And so, although there was a very small group, less than 50 people, probably for most of the 1950s, for all of the 1950s, the group was kept together. And what Cliff had the ability to do, and I think it isn't just a question of personal charisma, we're not talking about a cult, we're talking about the power of the ideas, the fact that he was able to relate to the way in which modern capitalism had changed. The amazing loyalty that he inspired in people. And I was told this story by Mary Phillips, who I can see beaming at me. I hope I've got it right. In, I think, 1958, she and 2 other comrades were sent off to Notting Hill to do a street sale and a stall. And it was a complete flop. They sold no papers. I'm sure many of us have been through that sort of thing. But the interesting thing to remember is that all 3 of those comrades are still in the SWP today. And that was the way the organisation was built. Yes. Now, things began to change after 1956. In the short term, Socialist Review Group, as Cliff's organisation was known, made no gains out of the crisis of the Communist Party at the time of Hungary. But the politics did start to fit. That as the nuclear disarmament movement grew up, as a protest against H-bombs in Washington, H-bombs in Moscow, the analysis began to make sense. And at the same time, with this new generation growing up, not caught in with the sort of dilemma, either you are pro-Stalinist or anti-Stalinist, as this new generation began to emerge, in particular, the Labour Party decided to capitalise on this by launching the Young Socialists. And, well, I'll stop there because that was the point. Quite a few of us came in.
Right, thanks, Ian. Clearly, Ian has got lots more that he wants to tell people, but we have to have time for questions and contributions. But also, if people want to read more about Cliff, there's a number of books. There are bookmarks. There's a World to Win, which I think is an excellent book, which tells you much more about Cliff's ideas. And there's another book. It's a bit difficult, this. And there's another book called Marxism at the Millennium, another excellent book, so people want to read more about that. If people want to put their hands up, I think they need to come up here and speak if it's being recorded. So if people want to show their hands. Honey, do you want to come up?
Yeah, okay. Yes, I was Tony Cliff's wife. I'll just say a word or two about that. I don't want to. I don't want to criticise anything that Ian said, because I think he gave an excellent talk, and everything was perfectly in order. He's done an enormous amount of really hard work on the subject. I'll just add a point or two. First of all, he spoke about how Cliff always acted besides thinking. And besides writing, always activity was at the forefront. So he didn't mention, possibly because he didn't know, because I didn't tell him, that Cliff, when he was, I don't know, young, 19, 20, 21, when he was a socialist, he thought he should be a worker, because the workers are going to inherit the earth, so to say. So he became a building worker for a year, and he worked hard at it, just like he worked hard at whatever he did. And he came home at the end of the day and just couldn't do a thing. He fell asleep on a bench every night, and after a year he decided, well, he's not doing any political work, so he left the building work. The next thing was, after the Holocaust, ships used to come from Germany, and on them they had the last sort of survivors coming out of Germany, Jewish survivors, and a couple of ships came to Palestine. And the girls used to stand up there. The Jewish girls used to stand up on the deck, and down below on the land, there used to be a host of young men. And the young men used to say, I'll have that one, I'll have that one, I'll have that one. And Cliff said, I'll have that one, because they then married the girls, and the rabbis were at that time in on this particular scam, and they married the girls and the boys, and then they said, shook hands and said goodbye, and that was that. So Cliff married a girl, and they said goodbye. And then, 10 years later, I came along, and he needed to get married to me if we were going to be together, because he couldn't travel. His passport was rubbish. A British mandate passport was rubbish, and I had a good old, South African passport at the time. So if he married me, we could travel together. So we needed to get married, and he was married to that woman, and and the rabbis had left the scam long ago, and he couldn't get unmarried. He couldn't get divorced at all because he didn't know anyway where the girl was. So it took, a long time for, I think, his father eventually found the girl, and they eventually got divorced, and so he could marry. That was I'm just telling stories, really. Another story I'll tell you is, when he first came, he said somebody came along, got somebody to talk to our group of 12 people who had come from South Africa as Zionist socialists to a kibbutz. So he came along as a speaker. We ended work on Friday at 2:00 in the afternoon, and he started talking in Hebrew, very fast, as he did, and he talked and he talked and he talked till 1:00 at night without stopping. And then he stopped and he said, "Any questions? Anybody want to say anything? Hurry up, you're wasting time." And he went on talking until 4:00. At 4:00 we all collapsed and went to sleep. After that, Ian mentioned a leaflet to the troops in Tel Aviv. Duncan Hallis was there, I think, among the troops. Anyway, they decided to do a leaflet, and he needed it translated into English, so he called me from the kibbutz to come into Tel Aviv, and that really was the beginning. We worked solidly for 3 days, morning, noon and night. After 3 days, I said, "It's hot, can't we go out for a walk or something?" He said, "What? Waste time?" Anyway, we got the leaflet out, as Ian said. Then another couple of things. Yes, Jabra Nicola, he mentioned. Jabra Nicola was one of the leaders of the Communist Party in Palestine, Arab Communist Party, and he also was deputy editor of the main Arab daily paper. He was as poor as a church mouse. I remember the fact that he didn't have any underwear because he couldn't afford it. And, I mean, it would take me too long to tell you about his living conditions, but honestly, it was awful. But he and Cliff used to walk up and down the beach every day for hours and hours and hours. They were big friends, and they learned from each other an enormous amount. There's another thing which was very important to Cliff's ideas, and that is something which isn't really very well known, and that is that there was an Arab uprising 1936 to 1939. That's more or less the same time as the Spanish Civil War. And the British were the mandate people. Their police and their army came along. They lined up all the people in the villages which were rebelling, and every 10th man, all the men, and every 10th man they shot. And Cliff was absolutely appalled at this. And, it really hurt him so much. And this sort of, helped his about imperialism. By the way, what they did also, what the British police and army did do, they recruited Jewish Zionists to participate, and thousands of Jewish Zionists went along with the British police to shoot these Arabs, and that influenced Cliff enormously. Right, I'm nearly finished. One other thing, the paper Ian mentioned. The paper didn't have one name. The paper had many, many, many names. It was people's voice of the people, class of the people, journal of the people, because it was illegal. And so every time when the censorship came, they had to change the name and start a new paper. It was illegally distributed. My particular job was to go up with the papers to the Jerusalem University, which Ian mentioned, to go into the library, leave it on the table, and run out before anybody came and saw me, which I did regularly. In addition, we used to distribute the paper by going up to roofs of buildings and dropping them down below so that nobody could see us, and we got the paper distributed. Lastly, when he came to Britain, he wouldn't have been allowed in had he not promised the British police or government, or whoever it was, that he would not do any politics. So he lived in Britain for many years without doing any politics. There's just one other thing that I want to say. He's the connection, I should have said this before, between his theory and his activity. It was not possible for him, because he was not doing any politics, to do which he would have liked to have done in demonstrations and so on and so on. And so he used me very much as his activity. So he never ever actually wrote anything current without discussing the act part of it with me and getting his ideas clear. Just helped him an awful lot in connecting the activity which he was not allowed to do and couldn't do, through me. So anyway, that's it.
Right, thank you, Honey, for that. Actually, there's a film about Honey on in this hall afterwards. There's a film at the end of this meeting. Is there any other questions? People put their hands up. You won't quite get as long as Honey got. The man at the back, and do you want to come forward as well? Man in the middle, so you can... Oh.
Yeah, why the name Tony Cliff? Can you say it so you get it?
He said, why the name Tony Cliff? I think there's somebody else over here who wants to speak. Do you want to come up as well? Yeah. Okay. Why did he think Paul Foot was a bit soft? And do you want to come up after as well? Do you want to take me first?
Okay.
I'm Tony Goodchild and I come from Swansea. I just wanted to recount one moment that I remember of Cliff. In 1974, I think it was, the second miners' strike, when they weren't actually on strike. There was a 3-day week, and the miners were working to roll. They actually had brought the country to a halt, virtually, and they were still on 5 days. And I'd been made South Wales organiser for the International Socialists, mainly because I had time and the party didn't have any money. But so we've managed to build a pit branch in Cwm Colliery, and the people at Cwm were looking for a solution because they were still working 5 days and bringing the country to a halt. And they talked about possibly should they go on a 2-day strike to reduce to a 3-day week in solidarity. And Cliff came down and he spoke to them and he listened to them and he listened to their arguments again, and then he said no, all out strike. And it was at the Cwm Colliery that whilst the Communist Party were organising a demonstration down at the National Union, they sent coaches down of their activists. It was at Cwm Colliery that our comrades moved all out strike and got a whole load of coaches to go down to London that day. And that's how I remember Cliff. He did listen, and he made his decisions by talking to workers, listening to them, but he had that theory and that ability to make that grasp of what was needed.
The very last conversation I had with Cliff when he was in hospital was on the day after the demonstration, if people remember it, against the closure in Longbridge, when 100,000 people marched in Birmingham. And I remember it because what Cliff wanted to know, even right at the end, how many papers we'd sold. What was the demonstration like? And there's a point to this. What was the demonstration like? What was the nature of the demonstration? Who was there? And every question wasn't just about what the SWP did. That was important, because the SWP was a factor in this demonstration. and it was a factor in shaping it, but also he was wanting to know the mood in the demonstration. And he could sense that because when he was talking about the balance of forces, this is something I think he took from Lenin, a really concrete application of what the balance of forces were by testing it. What was happening, how we got a response, who was there, the number of workforce was there. If a trade union banner was there, I always remember he'd ask how many people were behind the trade union banner. If a trade union branch passed the resolution, how many people were in the room, because that makes a difference if you think, if 3 people are in the room or 50 people are in the room. The first time I met Howard Cliff was at the time of the European referendum, when Britain joined what was then the Common Market, and I wasn't in the IS. And previously in Edinburgh, there had been a meeting, the organisation I was in at the time, with Ernest Mandel. And I remember Mandel because he was a good speaker, but he was like a Belgian professor. Very good, very clear, very good lawyer, Ernest Mandel, actually, at putting a case. Cliff was completely different. First, it's hard to hear this when you first heard him. His accent in Edinburgh as well just was completely unusual. For the first 5 minutes, it was like trying to grasp where this accent was coming from and understand the words that were coming forward. And it wasn't like Mandel. It was almost like short sound bites. But everyone hit home. And what impressed me at that meeting, even though I was a political opponent at the time, was there was there in that room working class people. One of them was on the organising team at Marksam, a young electrician at the time called Willie Black, who joined the IS as a result of a rent strike in Edinburgh. And you could see that he caught those working class militants, he caught their mood. In a way, and this is no disrespect to Mandel, in a way that Mandel couldn't do. And you could see as well he was casting that speech. And I don't think Cliff ever made a speech without looking at the audience and thinking who he was going to win and who he was going to influence. And that night in Edinburgh, I think he knew there was a young layer of shop stewards who had been through battles, people who were opposed to the Communist Party, were breaking with Labour, and his job in making that speech was not just to impress the audience, but to win it. And I just want to say this. I really wish, looking back, and this came to me in Genoa, I wish Cliff had been there. And I wish he hadn't had to go through those years of defeat. And he could have been with us when the movement comes back up again. Because, boy, do we need him. And he was brilliant at teaching and winning a generation of people to revolutionary socialism. And I suspect many people here regret having to go through those years of defeat. And I really wish, and in Genoa it struck me, in the summer of Genoa, when Carlo Giuliani died, the more we need people like Cliff now, when the movement is on the up and we have to take difficult strategic decisions. He was great when he was there. And boy, we've got his legacy here today. We've got his legacy in Marxism, the organisation we built in his thought, and we always will need him.
I'll take... Sure.
It's very difficult to follow that. I joined the Socialist Workers' Party back in the early 1980s, and you know you have many different stories of Cliff, we have different anecdotes. But I was just thinking when Cliff was writing, when people were talking, Cliff was writing his fourth volume on Trotsky, and I was an organiser in Sheffield at the time, and he came, he stayed down to a couple of meetings, and always used to phone you up, so come over and just discuss this, that, and the other. So I come round and usually quite excited to kind of listen to and talk to Cliff about whatever it's about. And he was absolutely besotted by this book, and he's telling me about what's happening in this book, how he's writing it, and what was in it. You know, the fourth volume of Trotsky, people haven't read it, essentially about in the 1930s, and obviously arrived to his death in 1939 and so on, and 1940. And he finished. He said, "Yes, it's such important work." He said, "You know, I'm taking really seriously, really thinking what he's going to say." He said, "Yes, but I mean, it's such a tragedy. The ending of the book is lifeless. So I've decided to change the ending." And I was listening. I said, "Oh yeah, well, what's going to happen?" And he said, "Well, I decided Trotsky's not dead. He's still living very, very healthily in Marbella somewhere, etc." You know, and I realised that he was taking. But I mean, so I was taking notes at the time, thinking, right, Marbella, have you got his phone number? Maybe I can get him to do a meeting for me soon, you know, or whatever. I realised he was joking, but I do think, I mean, from what Chris just said, really, I mean, obviously a very inspiring man in all sorts of different ways. I mean, his ability to speak and to argue and to talk to anybody in an audience. You know, this is something in which, when his funeral, and you literally saw a generation of people, you know, of Ian's generation, people of my generation, people of Chris's generation, and people of the generation of today, of 12, of 14, and 15, and 16 school students, as well as right across. He had the amazing ability to speak. Why? Because he just simply said, look, don't patronise people, never speak down to people, speak to them as you see them. And this is an obvious point, but it actually flows from his actual politics itself, you see. And I think this is the heart of it. One of the things I believe why the Social Workers' Party has been so successful really does stem from, when Marx said that the who teaches the teacher, who educates the educator. I remember reading Cliff many years ago, writing about Ireland and so on, and he was saying very similar things. Inside he said, who you'll have to learn from the class, but to the class. Learn from the class to the class. All your experience all the time. Honey talked about it then, when she said she goes to a demonstration, she'll come back, all his ideas will be taken from that demonstration, the detail and so on. So that learning from the class wasn't just about being nice, it was about making it test. That's the heart of what Leninism was about. That's what Marxism was about. That you have a theory, but you always have to put it into practice and always have to put it to test. And the final word I'd like to say, I'd just been reading for my meeting of Marx about state capitalism, and it's just, you get a sense of the importance of that thing. I'm not going to go into it, but in terms of what he did he was that bridge between the 1930s Trotskyist tradition to the bridge of people today. And I can't think we can underestimate not only the fact that we're all in this room, but a body of theory which essentially relocated the centrality of the working class in terms of agency and the Revolutionary Party within that context. That, I think, is something which we owe a great debt to, and why we're here today as well.
Take John, and then I've seen John speak. You want to come up as well? And if anybody's got any questions, if they want to put their hands up as well, I'll translate them.
I think all of those of us in this meeting who knew Cliff know that it's very, very difficult to convey to those of you who didn't know him the absolutely extraordinary personality that he was. Of course you can read the books and the theory and so on, but the fact is that in person he was just such I think a force of nature and that's hard to convey. But very much in the spirit of the mining comrade who spoke and what Chris Bambury was saying, one of the things that really amazed me and most impressed me about Cliff in the early days when I first met him was his ability to speak to working class people. And I remember when I was a student at Southampton University going to a meeting that was organised at the Fawley, at the oil refinery at Fawley, which was the site of one of the first productivity deals in Britain, which Cliff had written his book about, the employer's offensive productivity deals and how to fight them. And here he went to address a meeting of probably about 30 to 40 shop stewards at the Fawley oil refinery, and I tagged along. Now, on the face of it, what would he have been then, about 50-something, 55, something like that? So, 55-year-old, small Jewish guy from Palestine who spoke a very funny version of English, right, and a Marxist theoretician of great weight would be the last sort of person you would think would appeal to these shopkeepers. Actually, they loved him. And they loved him for, I think, two reasons. One, he kind of knew more about their productivity deals than they did, which, who'd lived through it, or at least they thought he did. Because he talked to workers up and down the country about productivity deals and so on. He hadn't learned it from books, he talked to people and studied. They liked him for that reason, but also his incredible ability to put over serious Marxist ideas in concrete ways. Sometimes they're funny, but the analogies he used to come up with, often from a Middle Eastern background, how he would explain the complexities of the United Front in terms of how a bullock with a flea on its back ploughs a field and so on. And you remember them. You hear them once, you remember them for 30 years. And yes, that explains it. And what's wrong with parliamentary democracy? How they don't even trust you not to steal the pencil when you go in to vote. It's always on a string. And so on. But the point about those, they were sometimes homely, they were sometimes funny, but they were always concrete analogies. Actually, they always rested on his absolute clarity about fundamental Marxist ideas. They weren't a simplification. They weren't, making it easy or making it simplified. They were precisely because he had such a profound Marxist understanding. And the one last story, because Ian said about being harangued by Cliff, and I've had my share of that. So my last story I want to tell you is an ironical one, really. This was somewhere about 1977, 1978. I was at a meeting that Cliff was speaking at, and I had my 4-year-old son with me, and I had some disagreement with Cliff about the method of electing the National Committee at this time. And Cliff was haranguing me about it. Don't be so stupid, John. What's the matter with you? Why can't you see it, etc., etc. As my son, who was 4, I think, at the time, or 5, came up and said to me, Dad, he said, why are you arguing with him? He's only a little old man. If only he had known.
Yeah, I'm to take you next. Is there any other questions or contributions that people want to make? Right, okay, I'll take you and then.
John Charlton, I want to say a little bit about another characteristic of Cliff, which isn't perhaps quite so well known, and it is his amazing patience. Now, I remember when we started to try to build an organisation in Newcastle, and this was back in the very early 60s. And, comrades today cannot appreciate one thing, I'm sure, and that is just how little literature there was. I mean, I go into bookmarks now, and I have to walk out, or I'll become a pauper. But back in that period, there was a fantastically little amount of literature that you could draw on. I remember the very first meeting I ever had to do was a meeting on the Russian Revolution, and we had no literature on the Russian Revolution, and I had to use a small pamphlet from a pre-war syndicalist group to find out what I could about Russia for that. Now, how does Cliff fit into this? Well, from the autumn of 1961, Cliff would set out on a journey. I think probably, if my memory serves me right, we had, at that time, I think we had 2 small groups in London. We had something like the beginnings of a group in Newcastle. There might have been something tiny in Liverpool, and there was a group in Glasgow, and that was it. And he would come, and over 28 weeks, he'd do 14 sessions of basic Marxism. And he'd come to the little group. Now, this is the question of patience. There was in the group we assembled an amazing mixture of people from rather sometimes weird backgrounds. But somebody who wasn't weird was a guy who had left the Communist Party in 1956 and had been thrashing around looking for something. And I remember one session where Cliff, I think, had been talking, you communists might find this strange, actually. He was talking about tolerance, really, of different ideas. And I remember this guy saying, well, he said, I can tolerate anything, he said, but not the fucking trots. This is taking place. I mean, what did Cliff do? He didn't smash him into the ground, which, of course, is what he could have easily done. I think at that moment he passed on to the next question. And during the same discussion, I remember asking my very naive question. Right at the beginning of my kind of political life, in a way, really, I said, how long will it be before the revolution? I bet that's a question that everybody thinks, you know. Now, the context of that, I'll just say, is very interesting at that point, because it is not true that Cliff was the only act on the field, because there were many other acts on the field. And some of them seem much more significant at that moment, particularly a person who was mentioned earlier by Ian, Jerry Healy. Now, I can tell you that if you asked Jerry Healy that question, he would be telling you that we were in that situation right now. And I heard that many times. I heard it around the Cuba crisis. That, you have to make your choice now, or you won't have a choice to make. That's what Healy was saying. Cliff said, he said, 10 years? But 10 years, you see, for when you were 20 just seemed like a lifetime. And that was a terribly important thing for us at that moment, really, because you could not look forward tomorrow to a revolution, but you could look forward to the collection, but firstly a series of ideas which made sense in that world, and that's what we were getting from Cliff. But never forget, actually, that the action bit, because we were all always told that what we had to do was that we had to be involved in CND, we had to be involved in the forerunner of anti-apartheid, and if a strike ever appeared, and there were a number of them appearing during that time, the early 60s, you had to get down there, and the literature we had was to hand out at the strike was pretty crude, actually. But it was that, making the connection. That was what it was about.
Right, Sasha will be the last contribution before we sum up. Be quick.
Sorry, I'll be very quick, but I just want to say, I just want to recount a personal experience, really, because my family came from Yugoslavia, what was Yugoslavia. I grew up in England, but essentially my family from Eastern Europe. And I grew up, on one hand, with what I think were some very good left-wing ideas from my parents. You know, they're always very, very good on things like racism and, you know, the welfare state and stuff like that. But, of course, we came from a country that called itself communist. That was bloody horrible, to be absolutely. You know, but if this was the future, it was foul, quite frankly. And that was very, I grew up quite confused. And you'd go along to school, and there'd be teachers who had been to Yugoslavia for their holidays. Also, always, some shade of Stalinist who would say how marvellous it all was, or they were complete reactionary bastards who would, go on about how horrible it was. And, when I finally came across the theory of state capitalism, it was such a liberation. It was such, you didn't have to jump over backwards to explain why things were so horrible. You didn't have to say, you make thousands of excuses for this disgusting regime of the East. On the other hand, you didn't have to sort of say that's so bad that I love the West. And I love, it was Washington, neither Washington nor Moscow. It was about the working class, and that was such an important thing. And Chris is right. It is sad that Cliff's not here. It's sad that he's not seen the anti-capitalist movements of recent years and whatever. But he did see workers smash the Stalinist regime. He did see that that complete dictatorship be wiped away by the power of ordinary people, and actually the genuine Marxist tradition beginning to come back that he did so much to preserve, and we've got so much to thank him and Honey for, and that's what I think is very important.
Right, thank you for that, Sasha. I think we all feel that we owe Cliff a massive amount of debt as well for all his contributions. Just to remind you that Honey's film's going to be on in here afterwards, just before I call Ian back in to speak. And also, this book's available at Bookmarks, Sartre Against Stalinism, which is a book written by Ian Birchall, and the other book's about Cliff. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the commercial. Right, I'll just try and answer a few questions quite briefly. Why Tony Cliff? I'm not sure exactly why, but Cliff had a whole number of pseudonyms, at least a dozen, nearly all of which in some way relate to stones, rocks, etc. One of his first ones was L. Rock. And of course the name... his own original name, Gluckstein, of course, contains the word stone. I think that's all there is to it. Cliff, as a speaker of English, yes, I mean, there was something about Cliff as a speaker that you do not get from reading the books. And Bookmarks have published a number of tapes. There's an excellent 2-tape set of a meeting he did in, I think, 1970 for the Lenin centenary. And if you want to get an impression of what it was like listening to Cliff, get one of those tapes. Why was Paul Foot soft? Just let me make a couple of suggestions of what you might look at, and then make your own mind up on the question. Cliff wrote a book in the mid-1980s about women's oppression, in which there's a chapter on the suffragettes. read Cliff's chapter on the suffragettes, then read the chapter on the suffragettes in Paul Foot's splendid final book on the vote. Or get hold of a little pamphlet that Paul wrote on the miners' leader of the 1920s, A.J. Cook, and then read the article that Cliff wrote in International Socialism, also on A.J. Cook. Now, what is interesting there is that Cliff's article never mentions Paul Foot. Paul Foot is never named in the article. Neither Paul Foot's pamphlet nor Cliff's article mention the name Scargill, and yet the whole thing was a debate about Scargill. Basically, I mean, maybe I'm a hopeless conciliator, but my position would be that revolutionaries always have to aim for two things. One is the broadest possible unity, the other is the greatest possible clarity. And of course, reconciling those two things is not always easy. And that often Paul strayed a little bit, not terribly far, but a little bit on the side of unity. Cliff strayed perhaps a little bit on the side of clarity. Read them both and make your own mind up, and you'll learn something. Chris Bambury's point about the trade union banners and Cliff always asking what they represented, I think that was one of the most important things I learnt from Cliff. I remember a conference, I won't name the comrade, in about 1969, and one of our comrades went to the microphone and said, I am here representing a certain trades council, I am representing 20,000 workers. And Cliff got hold of him afterwards and said, how many people were at the meeting that delegated you? He said, 12. And how many people actually voted for you? 7. He said, right, you are representing 7 workers. And I think that, you know, that is a temptation. It is always easy to get into in the trade union movement. And of course, Cliff always insisted on working in the trade union movement, on working through the trade union movement, but at the same time always being clear exactly what you did and didn't represent. Finally, there have been a number of very interesting contributions, particularly from Honey, but a number of contributions. Very interested in the contribution from Tony Goodchild, whom I don't think I've met since 1974, actually. We must have gone our separate ways. I do want to talk to as many people from different periods of Cliff's life as possible and get their recollections recorded. I'm in touch, obviously, with a lot of people in this room, but I'll be around for the rest of the weekend, and if people who would be willing to be interviewed would give me their email, their contact details or whatever, it would help. When I'm going to finish this wretched book, I do not know. Comrade here very kindly has urged me to finish it before I die, which I do indeed hope to do. Because I do think, as everybody has said today, and I'll say it finally, Cliff was an extraordinary individual. It is important that we remember him and we remember what we learnt from him. And what we learnt from him was not simply a bag of theory. That is, Cliff produced permanent arms economy, state capitalism, etc. And now we've got that, and all we need to do is go out and sell papers. Of course, we do need to go out and sell papers. See the editor watching me. But the world is constantly changing. What Cliff did was to look at the real world and develop Marxism. The world is still changing. We still have to develop. To be in the spirit of Cliff means to do that, to constantly reanalyse the world, but reanalyse the world in terms of the categories of Marxism.